Hello, everyone. I am joined by a special guest today. We are joined by Carol Roth, who is a best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author, and she has a brand new book. She's also a financial wizard, and if you do not follow her on Twitter, you are making a huge mistake. We're going to talk largely about her brand new book, The War on Small Business, which will come out on June 29th. So a few days after recording goes live. So Carol, thank you so much for chatting with me and sharing why you wrote the book and the importance of safeguarding and protecting small businesses.
My pleasure, and thanks for the platform. Small businesses are so important, and not everybody wants to talk about how important they are. So appreciate your platform for small business advocacy.
Absolutely. As you know, I am a daughter of small business owners. I technically run a one-person small business myself, so I'm totally in sync, and I understand the caveats and dynamics with it. And I think it's really important that others who may not be directly involved in it understand it. So any way that I can use my platform, I happily will. And you're the perfect person to bring on to talk about this.
Well, I appreciate that.
Talk about your background and what led you to pursue a career in finance. You call yourself kind of like a, how would you say, kind of like an erstwhile financial Wall Streeter. Yeah, talk about that and what led you to pursue this.
I always say I'm a recovering investment banker and that it's a 12-step process and I get out somewhere around stage 11. And, I think there's two reasons why I want to bring this up. One is that, I have the financial chops and have been around Main Street and Wall Street and markets for decades and decades. Yes, I did start when I was 5. And so I have the background to be able to synthesize, what happened with the Federal Reserve and what happened with China and, what's going on Main Street and kind of draw the connections where I feel like a lot of people who come at this politically have some talking points, and not to say those things aren't important, but they don't necessarily have the full background to kind of understand the scope. The other thing that's really important is just that I am the American dream. My father and my mom didn't graduate from college. I was the first person in my family to do so. I did not have the connections to, get me this fancy job and to, create this success. And so, every sacrifice that my parents made and my grandparents made, was enabled, in terms of having me be in the position that I'm at today, both in terms of my Wall Street career, as well as doing the things that I do now, which vary from the media stuff and writing to sitting on boards of directors of companies and investing in those kinds of things, as well as being the outsourced chief customer officer of a collectibles company, which happens to be a small business as well. So, these are things that I see the benefits of having free market capitalism and what it can do. Personally, I take that very personally. I've seen what's happened around the world. And so for me to be able to then stand up and advocate to make sure that we still have those opportunities for the other people who are coming up behind me is really important. Some people like to pull the ladder up behind them, but I don't. I have an abundance mentality, and capitalism is all about that abundance mentality. Everybody can succeed, the pie can grow, and I see it trending in the wrong direction as we move away from it. So that's why it's personally so important to me.
I fully agree with that sentiment as well, just because I'm a first generation American myself. I've seen what my parents have done. My mom worked in corporate America. My dad worked and still works today in his construction business, started it from the ground up, has had to start some things, seen some successes, struggle, then relocate from one state to another. And then the pandemic hits and he has to start almost all over again, kind of with his business. So I've seen how volatile, I've seen how kind of ever-changing businesses, but my dad has a very fearless spirit. So I know firsthand to that as well. And I think the millions of business owners in this country also similarly endure that, and they love it. And the crux of your book essentially is why government and also big business are going after small businesses. So when do you think the war on small business was formally declared? And why do you think there is such a aversion to letting smaller entities, one-person businesses or brick and mortar shops, or those that are on their way to becoming big businesses? Why are people so afraid of them succeeding and kind of operating in this unfettered manner?
So the war on small business was formally declared in March of 2020, but informally it's been going on for decades. And anywhere in the world throughout history where you've had centralized power, decentralization is always its biggest foe. So I don't think people always have a sense of the statistics. In the United States today, we have somewhere between 10 and 15,000 large companies. We, before COVID happened, had 30.2 million small businesses, and those accounted for about half of the GDP and about half of the employment. So I think sometimes people think that there are these millions of big businesses and just a handful of small, and it's really swapped. They really are the backbone of the economy. But the most important thing is that they have this decentralization. So they keep, they're sort of a fortress, if you have true free market capitalism, from the full consolidation of power in just a couple of hands, whether that be politically or economically. And that's one of the reasons why they're so important, as well as just preserving economic freedom, right? Like your parents did, there are people from all over the world who want to come to this country to pursue that level of economic freedom. And whether it's just maintaining their flexibility, whether it's feeding their family, whether it's growing to the next big business, that all starts with having that opportunity in a small business. So in preserving economic freedom, we have to preserve small business. But anybody who wants to consolidate power, that's a nuisance. It's a loose end. It does nothing. It doesn't get you any political contributions. It's very difficult to control. It's much easier to deal with a handful of big contributors than it is to deal with the small guys. So whether you think that it's an inconvenience, or whether it's really this formal intentional war, it doesn't matter. The outcome is the same when you're talking about centralizing power versus decentralizing power.
Yes, and we saw a growth of government, an explosion, if you will, this past year. It seems that all levers and levels of government, from the federal all the way down to local, I think people forget that it's not just the federal government that can abuse their power. States and localities can too. That's something we have to be mindful of. And you pointed out very well in your book as well, how different localities and states would sometimes even act very aggressively towards businesses. I saw it here in Virginia. My governor singled out specifically a region of the state which doesn't really vote in his favor, and shuttered businesses a little bit more, or he'd put like some arbitrary curfews on businesses after you can't serve alcohol after this time. We saw it in different states. I would say Virginia's case wasn't as bad. It was not ideal, obviously, but it wasn't like a California, New Jersey, Michigan, kind of the examples you pointed out. But regardless of where you live, and I know this happened in Illinois too, and most states that were kind of managed by blue state governors, you saw just closures of businesses for prolonged times, people losing their livelihoods, and having the inability when they had to, if they had to necessitate a need for this, to get a loan or to get some sort of kind of compensation from the government for lost closure, for lost employees, or other assets that were also lost as well throughout this pandemic. And it just seems that everyone loves to talk about small business, but when time and push comes to shove to defend it, they're nowhere to be found. They're usually chasing after special interests. So talk about kind of just the political implications from what people have been witnessing from all these different closures, and kind of from your view in if you know any metrics now, because I think early on in the pandemic, they approximated that 100,000 small businesses were expected to close. Do you know any updated numbers on that? How many have faltered or shut down altogether too?
So I have different sets of numbers, so I'll try to put them in context. And I think this is where my small business expertise helps to make sense of what's out there. So as of June 2020, so a year ago, the Hamilton Project, which is nonpartisan, is affiliated with Harvard. If anything, it may be slightly leans left. They had estimated around 400,000 closures by that point in time. The Biden administration has said that more than 400,000 businesses are closed today. But again, if you saw that a year ago, you'd find that hard to believe. I saw a chart that said 39% of all small businesses that were open in January 2020 are now permanently closed, again, by like major think tanks. The challenge with that, again, is when they say all small businesses, I don't know that they really mean the 30.2 million pre-COVID. I'm guessing, because I have been trying to dig in and like make sense of this. but I'm guessing that they mean of the, maybe the employee, like the small businesses that have employees. So those that were employer businesses, which is about 6 million, that would put that around 2, which foots, it makes a little bit more sense kind of in the spectrum of data. And then I saw another data set that said a couple million. So, you can guess it's somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million to date. Millions more are just decimated and hanging on by a thread and have, personal guarantees that that are putting them in debt and whatnot. And now with the supply chain completely disrupted and small businesses having to compete with the government for employees, it's unclear the kind of the long tail effects, but I just don't see that we're getting out of this without it being a 7-figure loss, which again, if you go back to what I said, about 10 to 15,000 big businesses, it's, exponentially bigger loss than there are the entire realm of big businesses.
And something that I've noticed too recently with some of the proposals coming out for the transportation bill, I think embedded in the American Jobs Plan, and we'll talk more about this too. I kind of want to segue into this. Obviously, we have problems with individuals wanting to go to work. There's so many different payouts to people, so they're getting unemployment benefits, and that creates a disincentive for them to want to go back to work. So I've noticed it even in just my visits to different places. It seems like restaurants are short staffed. I was just in Nashville. Their restaurants were super busy, but I didn't really care so much about them messing up my order. I'm pretty patient and I really don't care. I'm not going to yell at people, but I noticed they were short staffed. So they were probably getting orders wrong, longer wait times, and just kind of not being able to adjust. In Virginia, I've noticed the same thing too, just kind of optically from what I've seen. You always see the help wanted signs. I think anywhere across the country, you're seeing the help wanted signs. And something that also worries me with government starting to embed itself more, I thought we were starting to drift away from this mentality, but it seems like we're moving into it. And you talked about this very prominently in your book as well. And something that concerned me is that the government now wants to kind of act as like an investment firm or a kind of like an angel seed feed in this infrastructure bill. They want to basically be a resource for capital for emerging businesses. And I have to send this to you at some point off air, but it was just concerning to me. So do you worry that unless, let's say, people rise up in this country more so with taking over different entities, not physically, I mean, voting people out, replacing bad actors, replacing bad politicians, is there any change that's going to be seen? And do you think people feel hopeless in respect to that? And how can you curb government and big government policies in politics and kind of shift us back to kind of this economic freedom based limited government policy?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $28.4 trillion and counting in national debt question that we have currently. This is a systemic issue. This is not, if I get my guy in place, this fixes it. This is a systemic issue of government power being shifted, and you saw it all along that these decisions were made not based on science but based on who has clout. And they can say we love small business and we care about small business all they want, but we've seen anytime they're in charge of something, they throw a crumb at the little guy so that they can say, oh well, you got something, but it's just an excuse for them to direct more money to their cronies and to consolidate their power. And what we saw over the last year was the largest, most historic consolidation of wealth, let alone power in history. I mean, you had not just the government mandate shutting down Main Street and that spending being shifted to bigger companies, but you had the Federal Reserve intervening at just a historic proportion. And I lay this out in great detail in the book. And 7 tech companies gained $3.4 trillion in value in 1 year. It was a record year for initial public offerings. It was a record value raised by SPACs, which are special purpose acquisition companies. So the access to capital, if you were big and connected on the inside, was unprecedented at the same time that millions of small businesses were being shuttered or maimed. So that's just a fundamental disconnect, where you had the government who had the opportunity to step up and they didn't. And I had written a piece, and I kind of lay a part of this out in the book back in March, that said, if your goal is to really keep the economy afloat and not have a disruption in the economy, all they need to do was to basically fund those small businesses and give them enough capital to keep people at home and employed. And for like 2 to 3 months, that would have cost them about $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, which is a fraction of what they spent. People would have been paying in taxes. They would have still had that connection to their job, and their job would have still existed at the end of the period, and they could have figured out a mitigation strategy so that we could protect those who were the most vulnerable and let everybody else make the decisions that were right for them. But they didn't want to do that, because what they were able to do is, instead of creating that continuity, and again, by the way, this wasn't a bailout. It's not like the Great Recession where the banks did something bad. This was eminent domain. We've shuttered your business for the public good. Like, the government owes the money to do compensation if you're going to take property for the public good. But what they decided to do instead was create a path for people to feel like they needed more government dependence. So the enhanced unemployment, the stimulus checks, like all of these things are really a roadmap to universal basic income, and to saying, well, the government's going to take care of you. And while that sounds nice in theory, let's just be honest, nobody's ever going to attain wealth and get wealthy living on the government dole. But we know lots of people get wealthy and move and change their economic mobility under capitalism. So why would we want to do that? And they've completely disrupted the market in a way they could say, oh, well, look, capitalism failed. Well, capitalism didn't fail. The government shut you down. And then the government ran to the rescue, shoved a couple $1,000s in your face, and then said, here, we're here to take care of you. And that's really the scary part, is that if we don't right the ship, if we don't start speaking up about this and take it back, and again, it's not just about like getting the right person in place. We have to like tear the system down and get it back to a place where the government is not in the middle of everything, or even if they have a mandate that the money's not flowing through them and then back to us. If you don't do this, we're going to end up with full-fledged socialism.
Yeah. And in your book, you argue that economically speaking, we already may have hit democratic socialism. What led you to reach that conclusion?
Well, if you define it by the number of things that the government is involved in and how much spending that they have, I don't know how you could say that we haven't. And I use the term central planning because as soon as you start talking about socialism or communism or democratic socialism, like everyone has their own special definition. And I don't care what you call it, but a couple people in government making a lot of decisions and having a lot of purview and using force, coercion, and control, or some subset of that, is a bad outcome. So let's just all agree that that's some form of central planning, and more of it is less ideal for our economic outcomes. So if you look across government levels, if you look at federal, if you look at state and local, pre-COVID, so before we went, the crazy COVID relief money, and then now all the infrastructure bills and whatever, but pre-COVID, at those three levels, government was spending $8.1 trillion a year. That's like 4 times the entire output of Canada,
Wow.
Per year. So, to say that we have this very free system, we looked at the number of laws. We looked at it like kind of a 50-year period that was cited, and it didn't, I don't think it included the last 20 or so years. And at the state level, there have been more than 1 million laws enacted. And at the federal level, there were more than 20,000 laws enacted, and another 12,000 or 15,000 that fell under the realm of like regulations, when we should be at this point having economies of scale. We have a constitution. You maybe forget a few things, you need a few more, but as time goes on, you don't need to keep adding more and more, but they keep doing that. They keep restricting freedoms. Look what they've done to education. The fact that they've gotten in the middle and nationalized large parts of student lending, and how that's driven up the cost with worse outcomes. The same thing in primary and secondary education. You just go down the list. The number of things that they're in the middle of, and the amount that they're spending, I don't know how you cannot argue that that's democratic socialism.
And you also mentioned how capitalism and free enterprise have gotten a bad rep. You'd think with just the successes the system has had with it over the last 50 years, especially the last century, even, and how it's lifted so many people out of poverty. It drew my parents to the United States. Certainly, we're not a purely free market system. We've sadly drifted away from that. But you say that capitalism and free enterprise have gotten a bad rep. Why do you think the branding for it has just failed? What can explain it, and how can we improve upon that and help people extol the virtues and get people to kind of reconsider? Because you pointed out that so many different people who are wealthy are very hypocritical. They complain about certain aspects of government, yet they're totally on board democratic socialism or central planning, even though they have all this copious amount of wealth. Let's say famous celebrities, and you pointed out to Cardi B as an example about why that disconnect, and how can branding of this really uplifting system be remedied?
Yeah, well, first of all, a lot of them, and I won't pick on Cardi B, but I'll pick on financial folks like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, who, extol we should, pay more taxes, and I don't pay as much in tax as my secretary. It's like, yes, you pay a ton more. It's just the effective rate's different, but that's a different discussion. But if you look at these people who said they're going to give away all of their money after they pass, or the majority of it, not one has made a gift to the US government. There's nobody else who is drawing large checks each year. I mean, there's an opportunity. If you want to gift money to the Treasury, there is an address. I'm happy to share it with you where you can do this. So nobody has said they're such a good steward of our capital that I want to make sure they have more. So, I don't mean to call people liars, but they're lying. They don't actually fundamentally believe this. My take, which again is just my own hypothesis, is that they say these stupid things because they're well connected. They know they can help craft the legislation that is going to get them a loophole or them again exempt. And, it kind of makes them look good, and they get a virtue signal. Hey, I'm for the little guy, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And the reality is that they're not. They're being dishonest, or there are some people who just don't fundamentally financially understand things, and so they just say stuff. That's a large swath of people too. So I don't know what the intention is, but the reality is, this is a Marxist endeavor to switch free markets into capitalism and making it sound like there is this capital class, and that there's a disconnect between the workers, and you're exploiting the workers. Well, let me tell you, out of the 30.2 million-ish businesses that exist, because as I said, there's about 30.2 million pre-COVID small business, and only about 10 to 15,000 big businesses, so it's still 30.2 million pre-COVID. 24.2 million of those didn't have employees. They were solopreneurs. So if you are the capital class and the employee, are you exploiting yourself? Like, I don't understand. And if it were so easy to exploit, then why wouldn't everybody be doing it? So, it's this intention to get people who really, by the way, most of the people have good intentions. But as we know, good intentions do not equal good outcomes, and especially in economic realms. And people don't think through these things. And if you don't believe that it's all interconnected, look at the supply chain today. Look at the fact that they turned off large swaths of the economy and tried to turn it back on again like it was power cycling a modem, and didn't think there would be an issue. And now we have this dislocation in every aspect, from raw materials to production to shipping to employment, because of these decisions. Even the Federal Reserve came out in their June FOMC meeting press conference and said, well, we didn't think about that. We didn't model for that. Okay, well, you literally have $8 trillion sitting on your balance sheet that you created from nowhere. Like, why are you in charge of this? Of like, you didn't know this, and like all the rest of us kind of said, yeah, this is not a good thing. It's going to happen. So, that ends up being part of the issue, is that people don't understand the interconnectedness. And if you make a decision here, how it flows through the system. And again, that's our own failing, because we pay for the education of young people. And the fact that this is not part of the curriculum tells me that they don't want you to know this, because it's easier for them to gain power if you don't know this. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people in finance, because there is so much money to be made and they have big egos, want to pull the curtain back and make it seem like they're super geniuses, rather than the fact that it's just a great, as they call it, unsystem. So they make things intentionally opaque and make things sound super complicated when they don't have to be. And I feel like that's kind of exclusionary. So, that's where we are. You don't understand these things. And that's, one of the reasons why, I've got a whole chapter in the book dedicated to the Federal Reserve and explaining it in like layman's terms, so that like when you hear about it and you're like, oh, I know there's something there, but I don't really understand the scope. Now you can actually understand the scope of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think education certainly plays a role with branding free enterprise in a very negative light. You see it kind of through pop culture too, although there are some businesses I think that are now fighting back those negative stereotypes and extolling the virtues of free enterprise. I wish they would talk about it more. I understand they have to focus on creating a product, employing people, having a good workplace environment, but they could also talk about why it's so good to do this in this country, why so many people come here to start businesses or to seek out different businesses that they can't work at in their home countries, why so many people, even today with all the attacks on free enterprise that we see, people still will take the risks. They'll still go through the different hurdles. They'll have to fight government at some point. And just to start a business or just to start like a food truck, something as simple as a food truck has so many obstacles to creation, which blows my mind.
Someone's hair.
To braid someone's hair.
That moms and dads do, getting their kids ready for school all the way, in which, by the way, affects minority communities more.
The occupational licensing.
They're supposed to be wanting to help create wealth. Mm-hmm. So yeah, explain that. But you're right. I mean, they need to be calling it, we need to be talking about in terms of free choice, because that's what it is. And by the way, it's not just financial. If you want to do something and follow a passion, what a privilege. I mean, there's so few people around the world who can even take care of themselves, let alone have the free choice to follow a passion, to do your life's work and to take care of yourself. So you just have to understand that different choices relate to different outcomes, and that's okay, because we have different objectives. Some people, don't care about a passion, they just want the green, and they're going to make different trade-offs for that. But the government's been really crafty in this. What they've done is they've gotten us to fight with each other. They've got us to say, you need to pay more. No, you need to pay more. You need to do this. Instead of us all going, being like, you got plenty, governments. Like, what are you doing? If we all stood shoulder to shoulder and said, no, let's start with the problem being you, we would all be wealthier. Our houses would cost less. Our businesses would cost less. Our education would cost less. Our healthcare would cost less. They have purposely driven up the prices of all of these things to make you think that capitalism is bad, so that they can consolidate more power and say that they're going to ride in and be the white knight to rescue you, when they're the ones causing the problem. The call, Gabriella, is coming from inside the house. And this is where people don't understand, because progressives and people who are free market proponents have a lot of the same issues. Like we've identified the same problems. We just have different ways to solve it. And so to try to help these people understand, and that usually happens with age and experience, that no, like you've hit on the right problem, but the way to do it is to get the government out of the way, not to give them more purview, because they've had the purview, they've had the money. Obviously, that's not the problem.
Certainly too much government interference. I totally agree. That's why I'm the way I am politically, economically, why I run a business. And I think two aspects which really does threaten the government, you could say, would be freelancing, as we have talked about offline and on Twitter many occasions, and also something I don't really dabble with, but Bitcoin. I saw that certain kind of collectivist-minded lawmakers are really keen on trying to get that out of existence. And so it'll make people who are skeptical of Bitcoin be like, I have to rush to defend this because it's a decentralized form of the economy. So therefore, I have to defend it, even if I don't necessarily understand it or totally get it. So why do you think they're going after those two components, you think, with currencies and also with flexible work?
Yeah, so this is the bigger theme of the book. We talk about it within the context of the War on Small Business. We use that to lead in, but the bigger issue here is that we have a battle between decentralization and centralization. And like you said, the gig economy, DeFi, crypto, and small business, these are all things that represent decentralization. And the reason why they hate crypto is the same reason why they hate gig work, is the same reason why they hate small business, because it's too hard to control. They want it under their purview. That's what gives them the power. That's what puts them in place in control of more and more things and more money. And so obviously all of those things are a huge threat to them. And those are the battles that we're going to see play out and see who wins. It is small business versus the government and big business. It is gig workers versus governments and unions. It is crypto versus the government and the Fed and other central banks around the world. These are the fights that we're fighting. And yeah, I think that you're going to see a ton of regulation when it comes to crypto, because they know if they don't do that, they're going to lose control over the money supply, and then they're not going to be able to inflate, when all of small business is failing and all of Main Street's failing, they're not going to be able to go in and prop up Wall Street. I mean, the most disgusting things that happened last year, in addition to all the money that was printed and the lower interest rates, but the Fed got like the special purview to go in and hire a secondary or a third party to go in and make purchases on its behalf. They hired BlackRock, which is the largest financial management company in the world. And then they went in and they bought exchange traded funds that basically held or mimicked the stocks of like Home Depot and Microsoft and whatnot. And it's like, well, if you're trying to support the economy and make sure it doesn't fail, like why are you buying bonds of Home Depot and Microsoft? Like that doesn't make any sense. Like those companies are perfectly stable right now and have tons of access to capital, are amongst the biggest companies in the world. So and again, I have a whole chapter on this in the book, but just so many shady things that are happening from the Federal Reserve and the way that it's structured and the way that it's tied into the government. And these are the battles that we need to educate more people on, so that we can make the right policy decisions to help rein in all of those things. Because if we don't rein in the Federal Reserve, we're going to just completely destroy everybody's economic freedom in terms of the currency. If you destroy small business, the same thing, you're going to end up with like 10 big businesses, and you're going to end up with socialism. And it just, goes down the line. And this is supposed to be, the home of the free. We're supposed to be the bastion, and we have completely moved in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and I'm a little nervous hearing about certain tenets of populism. I think we're having this conversation in conservative and libertarian circles about this, and maybe they may be benign on the surface, but I'm a little worried that some elements of economic populism do sound very reminiscent of the collectivist type economic rhetoric I heard you hear from people on the left, and that you kind of hear from those from centrally planned countries of the 20th century. So that's something certainly to be debated and seen. So I just hope that people think, because I don't know where they get this disdain for it. I don't think you have to trade off having, I think their contention with it is like, oh my gosh, if you like worship at the altar of free markets, which I don't think many of us do, like we like it. I don't worship the free market.
I worship the free market.
I mean, some people, you worship the market, you worship God, whatever. But I noticed that I think people forget that even if you, let's say, put free markets atop whatever, I think people think that you don't prioritize family or married life, or it takes away from people wanting to have families, which I'm like, families are almost like small businesses, building blocks of society, and families have encroachments by governments too. And if you see that happen with businesses, you can see that happen with families. So I think people see that disconnect. And I've seen it historically with what happened with my family in Eastern Europe, where government came in and it didn't just prosecute families, they prosecuted businesses, religion, everything. So I think people don't see the connection. When government infringes on one thing, they're going to infringe on others. So
and let me redefine it. So it's all capitalism is, or free markets, is just free choice. It's just people making decisions. That's all it is. It's that, with the backstop of having property rights and the government defending individual rights and property rights. That's all it is. It's nothing else. It's literally free choice. So if we all freely chose to like go and live on a kibbutz together, that's still capitalism, because that's our choice. And then when someone decides to leave because not everybody's pulling their weight, then that changes into something else. But that's all it is. All capitalism is, all free enterprises, all free markets is just free choice. That's it. Free choice backed up by individual rights and property rights. So it doesn't mean there's no government. The government is there. Its whole purpose is to create be the referee and make sure that the rules of the game, the individual rights and property rights are enforced, which by the way, they're not doing. They're acting as an activist, and they're throwing the game. They're like, you won, you well, that was a penalty, whatever it is. So they're tilting the playing field. And so it's not a no government, anarchy scenario, and it's not like just a money thing. It's like just literally free choice. And so we're at a point that do you want free choice or do you want force, coercion, and control? Like that's basically the decision. And then there's also these hybrids that even if you think the government should be involved in something, you can still bring freedom, choice, transparency, these tenets of the free market into it. One of the things I talk about, not in the book, but elsewhere, is something like Social Security. So even if you think we need a social safety net and your employer, or, depending on, where you are, you are paying into Social Security, you're paying in, they're Ponzi scheming, they're using that money to pay out the people who are there, and they're leaving a government IOU, which, as we denoted, the government doesn't make any money. So that's basically a taxpayer liability in order to pay you out. So why wouldn't you take the money that you pay in and you keep it? So even if they've mandated by law that you needed to do this, but you keep it, you invest it in the stock market, you participate in the wealth creation process, you own an asset that you can pass down to your kids. And for the people who need help, who aren't working, maybe part of the employer piece goes to fund their accounts. But then that takes the government. Then the government's not allocating the money. It's just it's maybe mandated by law, but it's your money and you're keeping it. So like that's a way to take a free market element and put it into a government mandate if you think we need a social safety net, but we don't need the government to like administrate it. We don't need that in the middle. It's actually to our detriment. Like we're getting no return on that capital when everybody could be participating in wealth creation. That would change the game for all kinds of people. So it's those kinds of things. Corey DeAngelis does a great job of talking about school choice. So even if we use government money to fund education, let there be competition and let it fund the kids and not schools. So there are ways to still have like not complete free markets, but take those tenets and apply them that keeps the government smaller and doesn't have it under their purview where these special interests can influence. And I think that's where the meeting of the mind needs to happen. Because certainly like we're not gonna completely reset this whole thing, but I do think we can cull it back significantly and remove a lot of the ridiculous regulations that are anti-competitive and all these kinds of things that really level the playing field and bring in freedom, choice, and transparency into the process. And anybody who doesn't want freedom, choice, and transparency is a tyrant. Sorry, like if that's what you believe in, like either you're super delusional and you think that those people have your best interest at heart, but we've just laid out the case that obviously the little guy gets screwed all over, or you're a tyrant that you think you're going to be on the inside circle and benefit from it.
That never happens in an ideal situation. No, you may think so, but I mean, that's what I try to warn some of my conservative populist friends. I'm like, never trust the government. Like, guys, come on. Doesn't matter if they pretend that they're going to enhance families, although I think they creep more so into family situations on cultural issues than benefit them. So I warn them, like, you should go back to your roots. Like, remember this. I want to ask kind of something before I direct people to your book. Let's say, despite the obstacles coming to people's way, let's say, despite the threat of the PRO Act and just all these different problems that we're seeing, which kind of seem depressing and make people want to potentially starve off any, let's say, appetite to want to start a business. I still think it is valuable to start a business. And I think if enough people are have a gumption enough to do something and they're still motivated, I think the engine of free enterprise is still going to continue despite just all the different threats we see from government, federal, state, local, and even from big business at times. But what are 3 tips for someone who wants to start a business that you think are foolproof and can help people who may be doubtful, skeptical, given all the conditions that we see today?
Okay, so I never follow instructions, so I'm gonna change that a little bit and then kind of answer the question. But so I'll
Sure.
say assuming that we're allowed to have wealth creation and we don't go like full socialist, which again, we're trending in that direction. Hopefully we can rein it back. But the best way to gain wealth is through equity ownership. And so there are 3 different ways for you to do that. One is to build your own business and to build equity and value in that business. The second is to go work for a business that's building equity and ask for stock options or stock compensation. So when that business gets sold or goes public, that you're participating in the upside of that. And then the third way is to participate in the stock market or investing in other businesses so that, again, you've got part of that. So equity is the way that people really gain substantial amounts of wealth. Income is good, living below your means is good, but it's through that equity process. So in terms of building your own business, I think that some of the things that are coming down the pike that you need to be super aware of, which we've now thrown on the governments on top of it, but rising wages and all those kinds of things. I think businesses that leverage technology, that are highly scalable and that don't have physical locations will make it much better for you. But you need to have a 3-year runway. Businesses often take 3 years to really create a foundation for it. So make sure you have enough capital to fund the business and to live on for a 3-year period. And it may be that you started as a side hustle, prove out the concept and go from there. And then just make sure that you really want to run a business and that you're not just passionate about doing things, because a lot of people like to do a thing, but they don't actually want to run a business. And when you run a business, you don't necessarily just get to do that one thing. You have to market and you have to deal, if you have employees or contractors, with that, and you have to deal with government regulation. You have to deal with administrative issues and all those kinds of things. You spend very little of your time doing that thing. So you'd be better off if you just like to do a thing, go do that with somebody else and see if you can get equity in their business for doing it. So I think that's another thing. And then just, doing the sort of the right person, right opportunity, right time triangle. So, all those things have to be on point. Like, you have to have an opportunity that actually has the upside and is worth the risk that you're taking on. You need to bring something to the table that's unique, whether it's your experience or your connections or some special knowledge or patent or something that you're bringing to the table. And it has to be the right time, and it has to be the right time in the market, and it has to be the right time for you personally to be able to make that level of commitment to the business. So that's my little success tip there. But again, you don't have to own the business to get the equity. There are other ways to do that. And so if you want to own the business, great. And if you don't, find other opportunities to get equity. And especially right now, guys, this is the best market ever. Like, everybody's dying to hire people. So like, now's your time to go out and ask for some stock options. I'm just telling you, if you've ever thought about doing it, now's the time.
Those are very helpful tips. I'll even take away from that the equity stuff too, because I'm skeptical to invest in the market. Maybe I'm just not bold enough to do it after seeing what happened
right now at the elevated levels. It really is.
And with the whole Robinhood stuff, I know a lot of friends lost money trying to play in the marketplace, and they're like frustrated about that. But maybe that's something I'll look into too. And actually, funny enough, you mentioned that 3-year runway. I've seen that for my business too. Around that 3-year mark, I really started to have consistent income. I had better clients, more high dollar clients. So it really is true that it takes 3 years to see your business, whether it's a small business or one person business, to take off. So that is very true for those watching about that.
TGFO, thank goodness for Oprah. When Oprah went from her show to her network, it took her 3 years, and she has more money and connections than any of us. So if it's going to take Oprah 3 years, it's going to take you 3 years too.
That's very well said. I didn't know that actually, but that's great, Carol. All right. So Carol, where can everyone get your book? why should they get the book, and how can they connect with you on social media?
All right, so this is my pitch for the War on Small Business is, let me just be frank, I'm getting my advance either way. They're paying me whether you buy this book or not, but you need to purchase this book for a couple of reasons. You need to understand these arguments and you need to pass them along, you need to act on them for our economic freedom and for the backbone of this country. And so we do not move in the wrong direction and kill these opportunities for everyone. The other reason is that you need to tell the media and publisher that this stuff is important. This is the only book out there talking about the most underreported story of the last 12 to 15 months. And the reason that's the case is because they don't think you care. They don't think you care about small business. So if you don't buy the book, it will just validate that and no one will ever be able to tell these stories again. So it's critical. As I said, I'm a capitalist, so you can buy the book literally just about anywhere books are sold. But what I will tell you is that, particularly if you're in the US, there is a website called bookshop.org, and bookshop.org will fulfill locally from a small business independent bookseller. So it's just as easy. You can go online. They'll ship it right out to you, and then they'll actually tell you how much is going to the small business. And there's a big banner at the top that shows how much you guys have supported small businesses by ordering from bookshop.org instead of other larger venues. So again, most important thing is to support small business advocacy by buying the book. But if you want a real win-win, support small business advocacy and a small business, then check out bookshop.org, not only for this book, but for all of your books.
That's great. And where could people follow you on social media too, Carol, and follow your podcast and other musings of yours?
So the best way, I put everything through Twitter at Carol J.S. Roth. I say I'm sort of like a luxury brand where it's like very well curated. It's popular, but it's definitely not for everyone. So if that seems like a good fit for you, as you said, it's all funny. Almost every media thing I do, from TV to whatever, somebody's mentioning my Twitter account. So I try to keep it educational and entertaining, a little infotainment for you.
I mean, who could deny and really like laissez hair? I love it. Like, I have thick hair, so
yes.
I think that's great
my
too.
Political party. I'm a small business, small government, and big hair. That's my platform.
Hard to dispute that. You can't go wrong with that. Carol, this has been so much fun. I want to encourage everyone to get The War on Small Business. I've read it. I can attest to how great it is. It's a great template. And like she said, if we want to see more content like this from other creators to talk about why small businesses matter, we should encourage everyone to get a book. We also want to see her crack the New York Times bestseller list again, because she did before. And Carol, thank you again so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom. And I hope at some point beyond pandemic and whatnot, I can talk to you in person at some point. I really appreciate your wisdom and your perspective. And I wish you success with the book.
Thank you. And thanks for all of your fantastic advocacy on behalf of small business and gig workers and decentralization. So my privilege.